Utah Conversations with Ted Capener is made possible by the members of KUED in partnership with Jerry Taylor and Edna Anderson Taylor, proud to support local KUED programming. The Larry S. and Allison Smith Challenge Fund, encouraging individuals and businesses throughout Utah to support KUED community affairs programming.
She is a Ph.D. student in creative writing at the University of Utah, and in her new award-winning book, The Riots, she deals with being half Latina, being raised in a poor neighborhood, and how she has contributed to her autistic brother's isolation from family and from the world. A conversation with Danielle Cadena Deulen next. As a fourth-grade student in Portland, Oregon, Danielle Cadena Deulen listened to her teacher read poetry, and she was hooked. She has been writing poems ever since, and with great critical acclaim. Her first collection of poems, Lovely Asunder, won the Miller Williams Arkansas Poetry Prize and has been published this spring by the University of Arkansas Press. Also just published is her first collection of essays, The Riots, which won the AWP Prize in Creative Nonfiction and is published by the University of Georgia Press. Quite a year for you, Danielle.
Yes, it's been an amazing year.
It has.
Yeah.
These are both first books.
Yes.
Incredible, right?
Yes, it is. It's pretty incredible.
It's just luck, I guess, huh?
Huh? I hope it's not just luck. I hope, or I'll never get a third one published. But yeah, it's strange that they both happened at the same time because the poetry book I had been sending out for consistently for about 5 years, and the nonfiction book I just finished, and they just both happened to coincide at the same time, and they both got taken up by presses, so I feel tremendously fortunate.
So what's next?
Well, I've begun a work of another collection of poetry, which I'm just at the beginning of. It's a little bit exciting because I have these two projects that just got, completed and published, and so I'm right at the beginning of the creative process all over again, which is a little bit scary, but really fantastic as well. So the collection of poems right now, I usually have sort of an overarching theme that I like to begin with, and I usually stray from that at some point during during the creative process. But right now, my overarching theme is a sort of poetic essay of the history of psychology in America. So,
really?
Yes, we'll see how it works out. But it's a topic that I'm interested in, and that might indicate as well that I'm kind of looking for themes a little bit more outside of myself, whereas these first two books are fairly autobiographical.
Yes, especially The Riots. The poetry book is also?
Slightly. With poetry, I feel like I have more room to explore, well, what I think is as emotional truth, but it's not quite the same editorial process in poetry as it is in nonfiction, simply because in poetry I can stray into the fictional or stray into more surreal moves if I want to, whereas in the nonfiction I think I have to stick pretty much with what happened.
Pardon me, in The Riots, your nonfiction book, just out, you dig deeply into your own life, and you tell everything pretty much.
You might be surprised to know that I don't tell everything.
Okay.
It seems like a lot, and it is a lot. I am pretty candid about a lot of things.
You are.
Yeah.
Yeah, you are.
In the book.
So you could only write a personal essay book once.
Yeah, I really feel that it's probably true. And I'm still interested in writing nonfiction, but again, I've been sort of searching for topics outside of myself to do it. But I felt like there was enough to talk about there. I mean, I think just in my conversations with people, with friends and colleagues about some of my history, it came up over and over again. The people said, well, why don't you write about that? So I gave it a shot.
Oh, well, it turned out very well. It's very interesting. I'd like to talk more about it shortly, but let's go to the poetry book.
Okay.
Lovely Asunder, just out, poems by Danielle Cadena Deulen. And I'm going to ask you to read one of your poems for us. Before I do that, however, how come? You're a Portland girl. You've lived in New York City. You've lived in Southern California. I mean, according to the Riots, you've really been around at a lot of different places. You're still very young. Why University of Utah? Why are you here?
Oh, well, it's a fantastic PhD program here in creative writing. It's considered, you know, one of the top 5 in the nation for creative writing. So the people here who I'm studying with, and partly, you know, I got into a number of programs and I went to look at them, and you know, when I came to visit here, you know, the faculty were outstanding. The community is really quite friendly and really supportive and wonderful. But one of the things especially that I found interesting about the University of Utah is that many of the instructors write in multiple genres. So a lot of the poets also have nonfiction books and these sorts of things. And I was interested in that you know, before I even arrived. And so my very first nonfiction class that I took here at the University of Utah was with a poet, Paisley Rectal, and you know, under her guidance is really when I began to write this book.
There is considerable poetry, in my opinion, in your nonfiction book.
I hope so. Thank you very much.
You're pleased I said that?
Yes.
Well, it's true. It is. Then the question must be asked, is it more difficult to write poetry or nonfiction or fiction?
Well, I wouldn't say there's a difficulty that one is more difficult than the other.
Well, what's the difference then?
Well, one of the main differences obviously is simply the length of the Riots, which causes me to have to work much longer on a piece. When I sit down to write a poem, I usually sit down and I try to get the entire arc of it in one sitting. Which is easier to do with a one-page poem than it is with a 20-page essay. And so I found myself approaching the work slightly differently, just because I might go insane if I try to get the entire arc of a 20-page piece in one sitting. So my approach is much different. But you know, there are a lot of essays in the Riots that I took from poems that I felt didn't work as poems. I have this kind of this file that I keep, which I call the deserted island, which all of the bad poems go to, or all of the poems that are just not working for whatever reason. And when I started going through those, when I started writing the nonfiction book, I was looking through and I thought, well, you know, perhaps it's not that they're bad poems or unfinished poems, perhaps they're not poems at all. Perhaps these need kind of a larger room to exist in, you know, so syntactically it's slightly different, you know, but also just merely the length. And not that you say you can't write long poems. I can think of several, you know, poets that I love, you know, their long poems. You know, H.G.'s trilogy is 143 pages. So not to say you can't do that.
How about T.S. Eliot?
Well, yeah, there's Eliot's The Four Quartets too, you know, and obviously The Wasteland. But yeah, there's obviously you can do that, but I felt when I was looking through the poems that some of them would make much better essays. So, so a lot of the book of the Riots, some of the essays, anyways, I took directly from what I first considered poems when I sat down to write them.
You've talked a little bit about the creative process in both poetry and nonfiction. The arc, you said the arc process. As a journalist, I would interpret that as the story having a beginning and an end.
Right.
And what happens in the middle. Is that what you meant? Something like that?
Something like that, although I wouldn't be, because a lot of the work isn't narrative, because I'm writing, especially in poetry, where it's really more lyric. I'm looking for really the emotional trajectory of the piece.
Okay.
More than anything else.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, read us this poem.
Okay.
Okay.
Lemon. They loved each other, but a lemon tree grew between them. No solace in the way it leaned, as if to whisper from her yard into his, across the coyote fence, a promise of something greater. The fruit was a luminous yellow, triumphant in the branches. At night he'd stare at the tree's dim body, almost indistinguishable from the darkness, and imagine climbing into the V of its trunk, swallowing the lemons whole, his belly full of light. She'd quiver in her bed, dream of her arms turning to wood, snakes like ribbon over her radiant throat, lemons ripe in her hair. They remained hidden from one another, but gathered the fallen fruit, rolled them on their bedroom floors, severed them into halves, radial as open compasses, ate the brassy bitterness of their skins. Isn't this how it would taste? A sour citrus sprinkled with sugar, salt, the bitter aftertaste of rind. Or do you place an apple in her hand, a past sweetness in each crisp bite?
Interesting. Can you be a happy person and write poetry?
Yes, there are a lot of happy poets.
Okay. All right. What is your definition of poetry?
Oh, wow. My definition of poetry. I mean, there are a lot of people who say, have their particular definitions. Emily Dickinson said she knew it was a poem when she felt that the top of her head was taken off.
Okay.
One of the things that I tend to look for when writing poetry, not writing poetry, when reading poetry, I hope that writing poetry this happens, but when reading poetry, and the reason I was drawn to poetry is goosebumps. I like to joke around with my friends that actually I've just spent an entire lifetime seeking out literary goosebumps. When I'm reading through a poem, and I get this sudden sort of sense of awe, or this intense amount of truth, or this beautiful lyrical movement in language. Obviously, in poetry, there are a lot of things that distinguish it from prose. You could say lineation is one of them, although you have prose poems, so you can't really say that. And you could say that, that the language is very compressed, but I can think of many, wonderful prose writers who do exactly the same thing. Calvino is one who I'd like to claim as a poet. His work is really sometimes non-narrative at all, really intensely interested in image and in sort of lyrical tautness in the language. And I think that you could kind of go either way by saying what it is. But really, I feel like I know it's a poem when it gives me goosebumps. That's my personal definition anyway.
Do any of the poems you write yourself give you goosebumps?
I think it'd be incredibly arrogant to say yes.
Okay.
I don't think I've ever picked up my book and read through my poems and, this gives me goosebumps.
Okay.
There are plenty of other poets who do that. I hope that has an effect, that effect on others.
Yeah, indeed. And I'm sure it does. Won the award. Okay, in the Riots, you talk about your personal life. These are personal essays, and yet you have a method of having what you call still lives in between the essays. Now, which I found to be interesting. Tell me why you did that and what it means.
Well, in still life, in a lot of the still life essays, what I'm doing is it's a moment of my life when I'm examining usually a body that's still in some way. In the first one, it's my father, and one of them it's a bird who's dying. One of them it's the woman next door who's also dying. That there is it's come up in my life several times in which I've sort of been there at a pinnacle moment to observe a body that's still. But one of my interests in the book in general is to construct a kind of memoir that isn't linear. I mean, there are several essays that are sort of out of time.
They are.
Yeah.
They are.
And so, again, I'm more interested in the emotional trajectory of the book rather than a linear progression through my life. With the...
I'll get it. Get my notes. Thank you.
With the still lifes, what I'm doing is instead of having an entire essay, I'm just looking very concentratedly at one particular moment. And so that's why they're brief, that's why they're small, and that's why I'm looking at something. I really like to think of the book more about being about the mind's experience of a life rather than a life. So
the notes on the book throughout the collection, Deulen experiments formally, alternating traditional narrative with still life essays and collages that characterize a particular time, place, and sensibility. Yes. You just said that. That is where I get the idea that much of your writing could be described as poetry.
Oh yeah, yes, I think so. I mean, it is looking at, especially in those essays when I'm looking at particular moments, and interested in sort of the emotionality of those particular moments as opposed to.
In your book, you quote your mother as having said to you, "Stories don't have to be true for you to like them." Have you written any stories that aren't true?
Oh, I've written plenty in poetry.
In poetry, yeah.
But fiction is what you're asking about. You know, it's
yeah.
been a million years since I've attempted a fiction story. Here's the thing. With poetry and with nonfiction, I feel like because I draw a lot from autobiographical and also the lives of other people, the narrative is already there, and I can just play with the language then. I don't have to think about plot. As opposed to fiction, and thus far, in any of my attempts at fiction, I will begin writing and write, and I'll be so interested in the language or so interested in the character, and it just goes nowhere. You know, there's no actual end. For some reason, my mind won't pull together excellent plot details, you know, surrounding that. So
fiction's out.
So you know, I would still love to sit down and do a serious attempt at fiction. But you know, I feel like it's a little disingenuous to say that I might be able to sit down and write it, you know, immediately when I've been working into these other genres.
Danielle, most people, at least I think, most people haven't lived the life you've lived, and you're very young still, with your family, with being half Latina, a father who was suicidal, a brother who is autistic. We all have problems, of course, in our lives and conditions, but you let it all hang out in your book, The Riots. A lot of people wouldn't be willing to do that.
Yes.
Why did you do it?
Why did I do it? That's an excellent question. You know, when I first started writing nonfiction, I wasn't really thinking too much about the actual subject matter because I came to it rather late. I only started really writing it about 2 years ago. And when I began writing nonfiction, I was just more interested in experimenting with prose forms. And so I told myself, write about whatever you want to write about and just experiment in this new form and see how you feel about it. And later you can find your subject. And since, you know, obviously my life is an obvious subject, that's what I drew from. So a lot of the essays I think I wrote without the idea of them being published, and then the book was taken up so quickly that I think that I hadn't really considered deeply. Deeply, if I should. But however, that said, I have to say that one of my earliest influences was actually Alice Walker's The Color Purple, which I read in the 4th grade. And it was one of those things, like I went to go, our teacher, Mr. Hendricks, I believe it was, we had Friday reading day, and we all needed to bring in books. And I had read all of my books at home, all of my children's books. And so I asked my mother for one of her books, and she said, you can have anything off of this shelf except for that one. And of course, it was Alice Walker's The Color Purple. So after she left, I stole it off her shelf and brought it to class. And I was really, really riveted with the central narrator, Celie, and her letters to God, and the ways in which she talked about, very frankly, the immense, you know, tragedy and abuse that was happening in her life at that particular time. And I think that what happened as I was reading it was that suddenly she was going through a lot more than what I was going through. I was still going through a lot at that particular time of my life. But the narrator was going through much more, and additionally had this racial identity that kept her oppressed in the overall society. going on in that particular era. And I just fell in love with Celie, the narrator. I just loved her so much, what she had to say, and her sister was taken away from her, and I kept thinking about what would happen if my little sister was taken away from me. And in my affection for this narrator and in thinking about what was going on in her life, I think that what happened was, and in being angry at the people who were perpetrating terrible things against her, I began to become sort of angry at the perpetrators in my life and having more sympathy, I guess, for myself to a certain extent. That the literature at that time helped me to see my life in kind of a narrative format to a certain extent, instead of just having all of these things wash over me. I began to think more consciously of myself and sort of a character in my life. And the fact that she was, the thing that astonished me most was that the things that she was talking about were really outside of the ordinary. That was not in any children's books that I had read. And I think that I sort of admired her for saying and for being so brave to say something. And then additionally, it made my problems at the time seem less large, and at the same time made me feel connected to this larger human experience.
You know, that's really interesting. You should be on Oprah's show.
I wish I was on Oprah's show.
I don't blame you. I don't, all writers, I'm sure they'd like to. I'm sure.
That's a little dream of mine.
But you did have a difficult childhood.
Yes.
And you have been lucky. We talked about luck early on, but you've been lucky in many ways. You were raised in a poor neighborhood. Your father was alcoholic. Your mother was Latina. She was Mexican, right?
Yes, but she doesn't, in appearance, she doesn't really look Mexican, so there's not that.
But you're half Latina, and in appearance you don't either.
Right.
And yet you write that the lighter you are, the better in this world.
Well, yeah, just in general. I think that what it's done is has this bizarre effect of allowing me to see my sort of golden key through society, as opposed to, say, some of my cousins or my uncles who are darker and are treated differently. So I think that one of the things that it's made me kind of hyper-conscious of race in America. And like I said, being able to see the differences in the way people are treated because of those things.
You were considered an at-risk youth. What does that mean?
Well, I wasn't considered an at-risk youth. I was a very good girl.
Were you? Okay. I'm pleased to know that. Okay.
But many of my schoolmates, you know, in the school that I went to, you know, many of them didn't make it through high school. You know, a lot of them dropped out. Some of them went to jail. You know, it was really, it was what was considered a rough neighborhood for Portland, Oregon at that particular time. Portland especially has completely changed. The old neighborhood that I grew up in doesn't look anything like it did. And also, it's still Portland, you know, it's not Detroit or one of these other larger cities that have sort of, you know, an inner city culture.
Okay, you escaped all that with self-determination.
Yes.
And your mother, I think, helped push you along.
Yes.
And now you about to get your PhD, and then what?
And then a tenure track position at a university. That's the plan.
That's your lifelong goal.
Yes.
You want to teach.
Yes.
Why? Why do you love to teach?
Well, I've been teaching for the last 7 years.
Yeah.
And it's such a way in academia that, you know, you work as a graduate student teacher for, you know, for a long time. And it's you know, I'm not assisting anyone. I'm you know, developing curriculum and syllabi and teaching. And yeah, I love teaching. I think partly I had so many fantastic teachers growing up who took a specific interest in me. So whatever chaos was happening in my house, I had these teachers who ordered these classrooms in really safe ways to you know, delve into things intellectually. And so I think that I like to recreate certain academic environments that I myself admired.
You like order in your life?
I do like order in my life.
I wouldn't know it by reading your book. Right. But you do like, good.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing is, you know, I feel like in teaching it allows you to reach a large variety of people who might otherwise not be as well introduced to literature. So it's really exciting for me to get a classroom full of students and I say, we're going to be reading poetry, you know, in the first, and they say, oh, poetry, you know. I love that. I'm like, you all will see how much you love poetry at the end of this class. You know, that it hasn't been, oftentimes it just hasn't been taught well, or by somebody who's enthusiastic about it, you know. So,
and you are.
Yeah, I am.
I can tell that. I can tell that. You've been a great, enthusiastic guest, and you're a great writer. Will have a great future. Thank you for having been here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. My pleasure.
I'll call you Professor Danielle.
Okay, that sounds good to me.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sure that like most KUED and PBS viewers, you've seen those beautifully shot films, Wild River, the Colorado, Utah, the national parks, Artists of the West, the Snow Wolves, Desert Dreams, and many, many more. And the creative genius behind these projects is John Howe, KUED PBS executive producer. John's latest film, Horses of the West, America's Love Story, will soon air here on KUED. And I'll talk with John Howe and learn more about him, about horses, and about award-winning films next time.